Let's dive right in. Today, we're tracking the absolute, downright dramatic metamorphosis of the Australian Commonwealth. We're talking about a fascinating journey that takes us from ancient roots through a deeply complex, sometimes messy colonial period, straight into the modern economic and cultural powerhouse that we recognize today. Honestly, when you look at nations on the global stage, very few have a backstory quite as drastic as this one. It's a massive story of extremes, total reinvention, and just incredible resilience. You know, what's really wild to me is the stark contrast of it all. Just think about it for a second. How does a continent that literally served as a harsh, unforgiving penal colony, a place designed to be a prison at the very edge of the known world, how does that transform into a highly developed society celebrated globally for its exceptional quality of life? It's like they completely flipped the script. How exactly do you build a prosperous modern society on a foundation initially meant for exile? Well, that's exactly the puzzle we're going to unpack in this explainer. Section 1. Ancient land to penal colony.
So, to really understand this unbelievable shift, we absolutely have to start at the beginning. Long before any European ships arrived, Australia was already an ancient land, anchored by a deep history with its First Nations peoples. For literally tens of thousands of years, this wasn't just some empty continent waiting to be found. It was a complex, thriving environment stewarded by Indigenous communities with rich cultures, deep connections to the land, and incredibly intricate social structures. Any real conversation about Australia's evolution absolutely has to start by recognizing this foundational ancient heritage.
Moving on to Section 2. Exploration and gold rush growth. The trajectory of this land shifted forever with the era of European exploration. You had figures like Abel Tasman mapping the coast, and of course James Cook, whose arrival really set a permanent chain of events into motion. These voyages paved the way for British colonization, which, like we mentioned earlier, kicked off as those harsh penal settlements. But as the decades rolled on, those isolated little prison outposts began to expand, they developed, and they organized. And that essentially set the stage for these distinct colonies to eventually federate in 1901. Though getting to that point of unity, that was a pretty complex and often painful process. And we have to pause here because it's a crucial, somber historical reality that this era of European colonization brought profound disruptions. Specifically, the arrival of European settlers introduced diseases that had a devastating impact on Aboriginal communities. Because the First Nations peoples had no immunity to these new illnesses, it resulted in tragic population declines, fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural landscape of the entire continent during this period of expansion. Now, if you want to pinpoint the exact moment the narrative flipped, when Australia stopped being seen as just a place of exile and transformed into a land of serious opportunity, you have to look at the 19th century gold rushes. This era was the ultimate catalyst. The sudden discovery of gold drew massive new populations from all over the globe, everyone eager to strike it rich. We're talking about essentially tripling the population in just a few short decades. It brought in this insane influx of wealth, infrastructure, and diverse people, completely altering the colony's economic destiny. Towns sprang up literally overnight, railways were built, and a brand new sense of possibility just took root. Which brings us to Section 3, Federation and Global Conflicts. As all that wealth grew, so did the desire for unity. The pivotal year of 1901 marked the federation of the colonies. This was the big moment. Australia officially became a nation, transforming a collection of separate, sometimes competing settlements into one unified commonwealth. But here's the catch. While they were politically unified on paper, their cultural and psychological ties to Britain remained incredibly strong. They were a brand new nation, sure, but they still very much saw themselves as children of the British Empire. So, what changed that? Well, Australia's subsequent participation in major global conflicts acted as a massive crucible. Sending troops overseas to fight in global wars, fighting alongside but distinct from British forces, slowly but surely started severing that psychological and political reliance on British influence. All that shared sacrifice, plus the realization that they had their own distinct strategic interest in the Pacific, forced Australia to start looking at the world through its own lens, rather than just waiting for marching orders from London. They really began to rely on themselves. Let's look at Section 4, Forging a Modern Identity. The aftermath of those conflicts really ushered in the final phase of the country's transformation. Australia realized it needed to grow its population to secure its future, and this led to some major post-war migration shifts. The nation swung its doors open, bringing in a massive influx of new cultures from all across Europe and eventually the whole world. And this wasn't just a population boost, it was a total cultural revolution. It fully forged a distinct, independent, and vibrant national identity that finally and permanently stepped out of Britain's shadow. The modern, multicultural Australia we know today was officially born. So the absolutely crucial takeaway from this explainer is the sheer scale of this metamorphosis. I mean, we've gone from a rich, ancient heritage, abruptly disrupted by a harsh penal system, to a highly developed modern power. The nation used the raw wealth of the earth, the intense trials of global conflict, and the wide embrace of global migration to totally redefine itself. Which leaves us with this really fascinating final thought to ponder as we wrap up today. How exactly does a nation's dark, harsh origins uniquely shape the resilient, prosperous identity it holds today? Does starting from a place of intense adversity inherently build a stronger, more adaptable society? It's a brilliant question to think about, and Australia stands as a premier historical example for us to study. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.